So, we are 3 weeks into our current series. As I had mentioned before, the point of this is remembering that our connection to Jesus is a relationship. It's not just a bit of knowledge. It's not something that we need to memorize so that we pass a test. It is exactly like when you meet a new person. You're starting a relationship. You're going to have times, there were times where you didn't know each other. Then you meet each other and you know each other. Then there's times where you're spending lots of time together. There's times where you're probably spending less time together. And over all of that time, you get to know this new person, whoever it is. And there are benefits to the relationship, and there are things that are sometimes a struggle with the relationship. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's better than you could have ever imagined. The difference with this relationship is that it has to do with forever for you. Our connection to Jesus is our connection to heaven. It's our connection to what happens after we leave this planet. And I've said this before, but there is no question that makes more sense for you to wrestle with. If you're here today and you're saying, I don't really know what happens after we die, you know what? It's important to figure that out. Even if you come to a conclusion and you say, well, I don't know for sure, maybe I'll change my mind later. I don't know, but don't set the question aside. And embracing that question starts with meeting Jesus. But also, we recognize that when we meet certain people, sometimes it changes how we live. You know, if you've known anybody who, like some of you who are of dating age, you have friends who once they get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you stop hearing from them less, right? Because you meet somebody new and somehow it changes your priorities and what you want to do and what you plan to do with your time and where your focus is. One of the things that changes when we meet Jesus is because we live in a world that thinks in terms of not ever having enough. We could always have more. Even if we feel like we have a lot of one thing or another, we usually would say, well, but I'd take more of that if it's a good thing. And then for some things that we really like or really need, we would say, there's never seems to be enough of that. Never enough time, never enough money, never enough energy, never enough faith. But when Jesus enters the picture, that scarcity, that lack, is replaced with abundance. Potentially. I've mentioned this before, but it's kind of like having a bank account. And you could have $1 million in your bank account, but if you never take a withdrawal, it doesn't do you any good. Jesus says, I came so that they may have life and may have it more abundantly. So there's an abundance somewhere for each of us that sometimes we have to be reminded to draw on. The past few weeks, I've been telling you that when we meet a friend, or we have a friend that we want others to meet, we usually tell them about traits that we appreciate about our friend, things that we like best about our friend. So this week, I'd like you to meet my friend Jesus. He's overwhelmingly generous. We're going to start today in Matthew 14, where we see one of the clearest pictures of the generosity of Jesus. Not only in what he gives, but in how he gives. So starting in Matthew 14, it says this, in verse 14 of Matthew 14, it says this, Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send these crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, that isn't necessary. You feed them. They responded by saying, but we have only 5 loaves of bread and only 2 fish. Bring them here, Jesus said. And then he told the people to sit down on the grass. And Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up toward heaven, and he blessed them. And then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. And they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. So, no matter how we look at this story, it's overwhelming. 5,000 men, in addition to all the women and children. So, we could talk about how many that might be, that maybe it's probably at 10,000 at least. I mean, if every man comes with one woman, that's 10,000. If they come with just one child each, that's another 5,000. Now you're talking about 15,000. Maybe some come without a kid, some come with 3 kids. You don't know. Point being is, I think 5,000 is already so many that if right now we had 5,000 people show up here on the property and I said, okay, everybody, this is it. Everybody take a basket and get out there, and we got to feed every one of those people, and they need to have as much as they want. Every one of us here would probably be running around like, oh my goodness, where are we going to, did you get any? I don't know. Am I out? What? It would be overwhelming for any of us. And there's more than 12 of us here. Jesus called his 12 to him and said, you feed them. How could they not have felt overwhelmed? Also in John chapter 6, verse 7, Philip, one of the disciples, says to Jesus, Lord, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each person to have one bite. A half a year's wages for each person to have a bite. It's a lot of people needing a lot of food. It would take a lot of work and a lot of money to make it happen. In Philippians 4:19, Paul reminds us that this same God who takes care of me, he's talking about himself, will supply all your needs from his glorious riches, which have been given to us in Christ Jesus. And that is the memory challenge for next week. Actually, knowing that the tutu taunt was on the plate, maybe I should have been like, okay, so now you've got 16 verses to memorize, and if you can do it, I'll wear some embarrassing outfit up here. Anyway, this is for next week. Philippians 4:19, this same God who takes care of me will supply all of your needs from his glorious riches, which have been given to us in Christ Jesus. But before we move on to that, I mean, this is a great principle to know, because if we're ever in a position where we are feeling overwhelmed by a need that we have, Jesus is showing all of his disciples and us that he can be relied on as our provider. So before we move on, let's look at the story a little bit closer, because Jesus' generosity begins with his heart, not with the need of the people. He feeds the crowd before they ask. None of them were like, oh, where's the snack bar around here? Is there a guy going to come by and sell popcorn or something? How are we supposed to manage today? Nobody. We don't read about that. Before they even make their need known, Jesus in his heart has it to be generous. He gives when it's inconvenient. He gives when he's tired. And he gives when it costs him something. And we're going to read that in just a second here. Because remember, generosity really is not about excess. Generosity is not about you having more than enough and so you could share it. It's about compassion. It's about caring for others. It's about caring so much for someone else that we are moved to help. That's one of the problems we have right now. Most of us are so isolated, so busy, so distracted, that we struggle to see those who are in need around us. And if we don't see them, then we won't be moved with compassion for them. And if we aren't moved, then we aren't likely to help them. Jesus gives abundantly, not barely. Going back to Matthew 14 and verse 20, I'm just reminding you what we just read. It says, they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. So they ended up with way more than they started with after everybody had all they wanted. Also, I think it's interesting to look at in this story that Jesus said to the disciples, you feed them. He didn't say, all right, gather around. We're about to take care of this problem. I'm going to provide the food for this 5,000 plus crowd. He didn't say, bring me something to start working with, and then I'll make it more than you could possibly imagine. He says, you do it. So again, imagine when Philip says it would cost more than a year's wages for everybody here to have one bite. Hey, we need to get these people out of here. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. We need to send them out to, not to the nearest village to eat, to the villages. Implying there are so many people, they would overwhelm any one village trying to go get food. We got to get these people out of here. It would be completely overwhelming if he had looked to you and said, you feed them. You take care of this problem. And Jesus could have done it. He could have just miraculously had food show up for everyone. But he doesn't do things like that alone. He chooses to work through his people. He includes his disciples in that ministry. So anyhow, let's assume all 12 of his disciples, each one of them, have a basket, and they start handing out food. And it just never gets empty. Even when everyone has had as much as they wanted. Everyone eats. Overwhelming generosity. You know how we know it's overwhelming generosity? Because the need was overwhelming. That's my point, is that we are always confronted in life with things that are overwhelming. And we think they can't be fixed. We think there might be no solution. And then we become hopeless. But Jesus is our hope because nothing is impossible for him. Even in this situation, out in the middle of nowhere, very little resources, everyone eats. No one is left out. And there are leftovers. 12 baskets, one for each disciple. So Jesus didn't just feed the crowd. He taught the disciples, you can trust me to provide, even when it seems impossible. His generosity always exceeds the need. We may not always feel it, we may not always get a hold of it, we may not always see it around us, but his desire and his ability to be generous always exceeds the need. There's always more grace, there's always more mercy, there's always provision beyond expectation. If everyone in that crowd has as much as they wanted, how many bites is that? If it costs half a year's wages for everyone to have one bite and everybody has 20, that's 10 years' wages. Do you see what I'm saying? The point isn't if I go to church and I pray and I read my Bible that I feel like I can trust that things might get taken care of. It's that he's trying to convince us that it could be completely impossible, overwhelmingly impossible. And his desire to be generous out of his compassion, out of his care for all of us, for you, is way more than any need. But he wants to do it through us. So we have to trust him. Also, we might appreciate this story even more if we read what happened just before he provided a miracle and fed these 5,000 plus people. Just before this, in Matthew 14, we read that Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, was executed by the king as a gift to his stepdaughter. And then we read, this is in Matthew 14, verses 13 and 14. We read, as soon as Jesus heard the news, as soon as Jesus hears the news that his cousin is executed as a gift to a girl, you can imagine the impact that that would have on Jesus. As soon as he heard the news, he left in a boat to go to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Then Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick, which is how we started reading today. Jesus' overwhelming generosity isn't measured by only what he gives, but how freely, personally, and completely he gives of himself. He had just received devastating news. And he tries to pause, to be alone for a moment. And before he can have even a moment alone, he's headed off. Crowds already there. But his response isn't, hey, can y'all give me a minute? 1 minute? He doesn't say that. Scripture says he saw them all before he even got off the boat. And his initial reaction was compassion. In the middle of his mourning and his grief, he feels bad for them. Then we read that Jesus heals all who were sick among them. Just a reminder, the crowd was over 5,000 people. And that was just the men. Also, people were pursuing Jesus. You go through all the Gospels. People were continually seeking out Jesus so that they or their loved ones could be healed. That's why they were coming to him. That's why they had heard about him. That's why they were chasing him wherever he was. So this 5,000 men group, or whatever it is, 10, 15,000 people, families, they weren't all there just like, hey, I heard Jesus is around. Hey, we got nothing else going on today. Why don't we make a picnic and go out on the hill and just hear what he has to say? Or, hey, let's go out there. Apparently he does miracles. Maybe he'll provide a bunch of food for all of us. That was never in the plan. So we have to assume a good number of those people were there specifically to be healed. But because we don't know for sure, I don't know, let's just assume that maybe just like 1 in 10 wanted to be healed out of all those people. So let's say it's a minimum of 5,000 people. 1 in 10, that's 500 people. If he just spent a minute or two with every one of them, that is a 16-hour day. A 16-hour day full of ministry, of giving and giving and giving. After he showed up mourning, grieving for his cousin, then 16 hours of gimme, 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 gimme. And his response isn't, honestly, you people, is it never enough? His first thought is compassion, love. And then at the end of that day, more provision. He feeds everybody who's there. And manages to squeeze in a great lesson for his followers in the process. Because again, it's not about what he gives, it's about how he gives. He himself is generous. overwhelmingly so. So that when you are thinking to yourself, I would hope that sometime this week, maybe it would dawn on you that something that you have, a person in your life, an item that you need, an item that you have that you didn't really need but is really great to have. I don't know, food also, whatever it might be, that at some point this week it might occur to you, this is amazing. I am so grateful to have this. This is a good thing. And then we can be reminded that in James 1:17, James tells us, whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God, our Father, who created all the lights in heaven. Jesus is overwhelmingly generous with his compassion, with his power, with his provision, and with his presence, and ultimately with his life. When we bring what little we have to Jesus, we discover that in him there is always more than enough.